I am Curran Bhatia. This is Ask the Experts. Lucky enough to be talking to Dan Rafael, boxing writer for ESPN. You've been covering boxing for such a long time, Dan. So, of course, the first question is, how are you holding up in these crazy times? We know the global pandemic. How are you holding up?
I mean, I miss boxing, but it's a small matter when you think about everything that's going on in the world right now. So we're fine. I mean, my wife and son, we're just in the house doing our thing. Uh, every day kind of seems the same at this point. There's still a few things to do in terms of the work, but you know, I guess we're a lot better off than a lot of people could be. We've got shelter, we're not sick, we've got clothes in the bag, we got food in the fridge, and just a little bored. I'm gonna use some of this time though. To be honest, I'm gonna go through as people that may follow me on my social media. I have a lot of boxing collectibles, my programs and posters and all that kind of stuff and cards and everything. I'm going to take some time maybe and try to, organize a little better than it has been. Maybe that'll be my project for the next long term for the next few months.
No, speaking of your social media, I know that you have an anniversary coming up. In August, it's going to be your 10-year Twitter anniversary. And I'll tell you why I know this, because the first time I met you—
I didn't even think about that. You're right, though.
Yeah, and the first time I met you in person, I just started at HBO, and I was down in St. Louis for
Exactly.
Devin Alexander versus Kotelnik, and I ran into you in the craft services area, introduced myself, told you I was a fan of your work, and you said at that time, August of 2010, that you had just got on Twitter. So that's a big deal for you, right?
I'm going to tell you about that. That's funny you mentioned that. Now that you mentioned, I know that is the time when I did that. In fact, you're right. It was the Devin Alexander Kotelnik in St. Louis. And the reason why I started my Twitter account in St. Louis the day of that fight was I had been asked over a period of time by a lot of people in boxing, as well as fans and that sort of thing, in my chat that I used to do, would I consider doing Twitter or joining more social media? At that time, I mean, I had like a personal Facebook page, but I didn't have Twitter. I didn't have a boxing related Facebook page and no other social media that I used. And people asked about it all the time. So I went to a fight in Las Vegas. I believe it was the rematch between Juan Manuel Marquez and Juan Diaz, which was an HBO pay-per-view fight.
Yep.
I think we're talking about the Alexander fight that was in August. I believe that fight was like July of
that was
year.
July 31st, 2010, I believe. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the days at the Mandalay Bay, I was in the media center. And I really didn't really know what Twitter, what it was about so much. I didn't follow it, didn't use it. A lot of people that are on it. But one of the guys that worked the social media for HBO was in the media center. He's like, come over and I'll show you what it's all about. So he put out a message to the folks that followed the HBO Twitter at that time. Hey, I'm here with Rafael in the media center for the fight. You got any questions for him? Okay, so we waited a minute, and all of a sudden a bunch of questions popped up. And so we did a mini chat, so to speak, right there in the media center. And he's like, you really should join. I was like, that's a pretty good idea. I'll think about it. Then that event in St. Louis.
Right.
So before the fight, the Friday night, I go out to eat dinner, me and Max Kellerman, who was there working the event as an HBO commentator. Max and I have been good friends for 20 years practically. So we go out to have dinner that night, and Max is on Twitter. He had a lot of followers. I don't remember what it was, but he's like, you really join this. You get a lot out of it, both in terms of, providing information and entertainment value for yourself and your profile, etc. So I was like, yeah, I'll think about it. So he showed me his and showed me a few more things about it. And I was like, no, I'll think about it. You remember in that weekend, it rained that Saturday of the day of the fight, pouring rain. I was looking forward to spending some time that day, kind of seeing the sights of the city and taking a walk around St. Louis, and really couldn't really do much because it was such terrible, terrible weather. So while I was sort of hanging in my hotel room, kind of bored, I was like, let me see what this Twitter's all about. And I went on that afternoon. I created my Twitter account, and I told Max, I texted him or emailed him or whatever. I told a friend of mine that had a sports radio station in St. Louis, Bernie Nicholas, who worked also as a columnist for the St. Louis newspaper. And I said, hey guys, I just started this. And I guess they retweeted it or let people know. And so within a couple of hours, I all of a sudden had a couple of hundred followers. Like, oh my God. By the end of the night, I had or the end of the weekend, I probably had over 1,000. This is unbelievable. And started it. Then there you go. And the rest is history.
The rest is history. You now have over 200,000 followers. I'm
almost
sure
250 at this point, or 240, something like that.
There you go. And I'm sure every time there's a big fight, more and more people start to follow you. So that is one thing that I feel like you've been able to do really well as a boxing writer, is engage with fans, right? You're able to chat with them on Twitter. And when I told people that I was going to be interviewing Dan Rafael, you can guess the first question everyone had was the chat. How do we get the chat back? What do we do? So I understand it's obviously not your decision,
Sure.
the boxing chat. And just for anyone who may not know, the boxing chat, Dan used to do a weekly boxing chat. Fans could chime in. It was actually a great place to learn about boxing news, rumors, things like that. I'm sure you've gotten this question so many times, but is there any way to get the chat back, even in a different form? Anything we can do?
I mean, I've thought about bringing it back, just like doing it within the confines of like my Facebook page or Twitter. But in terms of like on the official site, it's no longer, it doesn't exist. And the reason is not because they didn't like it or it was no good or people didn't join it. Remember, for a long period of, first of all, I did chats at USA Today even before I was at ESPN that proved to be somewhat popular. I didn't do it quite as regularly. I didn't do it necessarily once a week, but I did it every couple of weeks or certainly before a major fight. And it was a weekly thing, and I really enjoyed it. And people think like I was getting paid extra money to do it or I was doing it. That is just not true. I did it because I liked it. I had a good time. It was enjoyable. I would do it for several hours every Friday as long as I could squeeze that in. What happened is the software that the company used to support those chats, because if you recall, for a long period of time, it wasn't just the boxing chat. There was other writers.
Oh, there was tons, yeah.
Of course, they did them in all kinds of different things. Not to mention in other sports and boxing in particular, say for example, there's a pay-per-view fight or there's some big fight on one of the networks. Their PR folks would get some of the boxers to do their own chat, and we'd have like a 20-minute chat with Manny Pacquiao or Oscar De La Hoya or whoever it was that was in the big fight of that week. That software was no longer being used or supported by the company, and one by one they went. I was able to maintain it the longest because I was the most into it, I guess. And by the time it was over, mine was the last one standing. And then eventually the software just wouldn't work anymore and no one was there to support it. So it just went away. And, I had a blast doing it. And, maybe sometime in the future and in some place we can, rekindle it. But we'll all of us have our good memories of Pay the Man Shirley on Friday afternoons.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many inside jokes that came out of it. Hopefully, we can bring it back in some way. So let me ask you this: we talked a little bit about coronavirus. Obviously, that's on everyone's mind because it's disrupted the world of sports that we know. UFC, I think the latest news is Ferguson versus Gaethje is happening April 18th. From what's being reported is it's a venue in the West Coast. I'm guessing that's going to mean California or Vegas, but who knows at this point. What do you think about that? Do you think that Dana White and the UFC should move forward with an event on April 18th?
I'm not one to get into their business. I don't know exactly what they're planning. I'm pretty sure it won't be in Las Vegas. I mean, I have spoken during this whole situation to Bob Bennett from the Nevada Commission on a multitude of topics, and I don't see the Nevada Commission an event in combat on April, I believe 18th, is it?
I think it was April 18th.
And in California, their commission is also no longer doing events through a certain period of time. So the inference that I draw is that it would have to be on some kind of Native American Indian reservation where they have separate tribal commissions that oversee their sporting events, number one. I did see a tweet from Dana White confirming that it was in fact the match that you mentioned. And I believe that the end of the tweet was somewhere on Earth. They're not revealing the venue. And I assume by the time you put this podcast up, we'll know sort of where it's supposed to be. But, on the one hand, there'll be a lot of interest because there's been such a lack of live sports that people are dying to see, no pun intended, to see live events. Sort of like it was live, but there was a lot of attention paid to WrestleMania over the weekend, even maybe more so than a typical WrestleMania would draw, even though it was taped and it wasn't in front of a live audience, but it was something new and different, and so it got a lot of attention. I have mixed feelings about what Dana's trying to do. I understand his desire to sort of, keep the business moving, to give people a diversion, to prove that he can do it. He does have ego, and I'm not saying that in any negative way. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Dana White. I know Dana a little bit. I like Dana. Haven't had too many interactions, but mine with him have always been positive. So I like the guy, and I think he's a hell of a promoter. So I see where he's coming from, but I also don't know if it's the wisest thing. I don't know what the setup is going to be. I'm assuming obviously it's not going to have any live crowd. If the athletes are willing to do it, and the support staff and all the other people that need to be in place are willing, I guess, but I also would be concerned about if somebody that had it could spread it among a couple of hundred people that would probably take them out such an event. The other thing I was thinking about, and like you mentioned, I was doing Chris Mannix's podcast and we talked about some of the stuff with how to deal with this, and we talked about closed door fights. I didn't mention this, but I've thought about this also. Anytime there's I don't know what the exact rules are in terms of an MMA event, but at least in boxing, you have to have, ambulances on site in case there's some kind of serious injury in one of the matches, and they have to be transported to the hospital. If you're in a place where they're having a lot of patients coming into a hospital because of the coronavirus, I think the last thing in the world you want to do is clog up a hospital because there was an incident that happened at a combat sports event that was unnecessary to take place in the first place. So, on that point of view, I might be a little reticent to have a combat sports event go forward. So I guess we'll have to see where they put it, under what exact rules and regulations they're going to do it on. So I personally am not a fan of them going forward with it, but I understand where Dana's coming from, and like I said, I have a lot of respect for him.
Yeah, I mean, there really is two sides of it. One is, like you said, you don't want to clog hospitals or create more safety concerns. Now, if there is a way to somehow do it safely, and you're able to give entertainment to fans who are so lacking entertainment, help people who are at home have some kind of escapism, so there's really two sides of it. So I wanted to ask you too, of course, with what we're dealing with, I did some research. I looked up, like, during the Spanish flu, there actually were boxers who fought at the time. There's been things throughout the years. Boxing's been around for a long time. You've covered it for a few decades. Have you ever seen anything
Only two,
like?
Not a few.
There you go. Sorry, a couple decades, I should say. Have you ever seen anything close to this disruptive? I mean, we know that during 9/11, Hopkins, Trinidad was scheduled, but that was moved 2 weeks later, so that wasn't too bad. I mean, this has to be obviously above and beyond anything you've ever seen in terms of disruption.
Oh, without question. No question about it. You mentioned the Hopkins and Trinidad fight. That fight was supposed to take place on September 15th at Madison Square Garden. Matter of fact, 9/11 happened. I was supposed to go to New York City to cover that fight on 9/12. Obviously, the fight was postponed, but it did get 2 weeks later on the 29th. Some people think maybe it was a little bit too quick after 9/11. I was there, and it was one of the most memorable things I've ever covered, just in terms of the atmosphere. It wasn't the greatest fight. It was a brilliant performance from Bernard Hopkins, the way he took apart Felix Trinidad. But, I have vivid memories of being in New York in that time right after 9/11. This is a lot different than that, because as terrible as what happened on 9/11 was, and it's, a horrific situation, obviously, the direct impact, the lives lost, the city impact, it was just one city, basically, and then of course we had, I'm in the Washington DC area. We had our own situation here because one of the planes was flown into the Pentagon. Folks that died in the field in Pennsylvania. But in terms of the traumatic events of the city, it was basically confined to New York, not the rest of the country. This is totally different. This is the entire world, not just the United States. So as that was, like you said, it was a huge fight. It was postponed for only 2 weeks. The fight did happen. I think it did help in the larger scale of things to help bring normalcy back to New York City. As emotional, as sad as that night was, people don't really know how to react. If they should cheer, if they should clap, if they should cry. It was a weird feeling the whole time. But there's never been anything disruptive like this in all of sports, regardless of it's boxing or some other sport. You talk about like an NFL or baseball or basketball or hockey. They've all had work stoppages that have disrupted seasons, canceled seasons. I was a young journalist in boxing, but working in a daily newspaper as a desk editor and a general assignment reporter. When the World Series was canceled, in I believe it was 1994. That was disruptive. But this is totally different, because that's not just one sport where they screwed up the baseball postseason. This is every single sport that exists in the world, from the biggest sports there are, like the NBA and MLB. Now there's the disruptions are going to come to the NFL, whether it's the draft situation or are they going to be able to start training camps on time. All the way through every other sport you can think of. So we've never seen anything like this. Period. Not even close.
No, I totally agree. I said this on the debate show I'm on, Standing 8 Count, where that boxing's never really had an off season, and now we're dealing with an off season. Of course, every other sport is also dealing with it at the same time. So obviously, people are using this time to catch up on things, maybe organize some things at home, things like that. Are you using this time to reflect on your career at all? Like we said, you've been in this game for 2 decades. You've had remarkable consistency. So are you using this time to reflect on everything you've done, and how have you been able to just be so consistent with your work and your boxing reporting?
I can't say I've reflected on it. I mean, I just sort of try to do my daily activity the way I normally would. I mean, I actually have, even though there's no fights going on, no business being done in the sport. There's really no news happening. But there have been a few things to write. We have come up with a few things. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, one of the things I have worked on over the last, probably week and a half or so is, like you mentioned, there is never an off season of boxing. I've always viewed the off season of boxing as basically like, the second week of December till about the second week of January. And even last year,
Exactly.
some of the big promoters did fights at the end of December. There was really no off season. But this is the first time where there's ever been several weeks in a row with literally no fights of consequence pretty much anywhere in the world. So what we decided to do was take a look at all the different weight classes and do what we call division resets. Do 2 at a time, starting with heavyweight and cruiserweight together, 2 sections all the way down. The last one will be the 3 small weight classes. We'll put the 3 together, straw weights, junior flyweights, and flyweights. Anyway, and answer a series of questions about each division, like, what the biggest fights are, who's the dark, what questions do I have about that particular division. So I've spent time writing those pieces, and they've been rolling out every couple of days. We've published at this point, I think, about 4 of them, and there's still the other 4 that are in the can, and so that's kept me busy. Some other things that we've worked on. We're working on stories where we sort of come up with what if there's a tournament in boxing, like we've seen the World Boxing Super Series and we've seen other tournaments over the years. If you could make a tournament without worrying about the networks that they might fight on, pick a couple of divisions that you'd want to do tournaments on. So I picked 2 divisions that I was interested in, and my colleague Steve Kim picked 2 others that he was interested in, and so we've sort of been doing stuff like that. So there's things that you can do, but at some point you kind of run out of those evergreen topics because at the end of the day, you want to see the action back in the ring.
And no, absolutely. And it's good that you're keeping busy. And like I said, it really has been a remarkably consistent career. A lot of times when you want to see a recap of a fight, the first thing people go to is that Dan Rafael recap article. We talked about the chat. We talked about Twitter. Throughout your years, I'm just curious for you as a journalist, how have you handled criticism from people? Has there been criticism? I know that years ago there was the Deadspin article about you, and they said something to like, the only thing that stands out about Dan Rafael is nothing at all. Have you heard criticism, and how have you responded to that through the years?
You know what? I've heard it for 20 years.
Yeah.
In the beginning, it would get you upset, and you get, I'd get upset about it. But it got to a certain point where you're like, you're never going to please everybody. Everybody's going to have an opinion. They don't know me. I was only concerned about, that I was happy with the work I was doing, that the editors were happy with the work that I was doing. And we're trying to be as fair as possible. And, if you quote per people, do it in context, do it accurately, and just follow the basic tenets of journalism. And, if you like my opinion about something, that's, you have your own opinion. I don't, I'm not going to, belittle that. So be it. But yeah, I get criticized all the time. But, at the end of the day, when you get to a certain position in any industry, I guess, you're going to be a target for criticism. As it happens, I've worked for 2 very big organizations in media, USA Today and ESPN. Comes with the territory. So you sort of, you'll learn. You grow a thicker skin year by year. And so mine is impenetrable at this point.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm glad that you're still going, putting out great work. So obviously the economic impacts of what's going on in the world, everyone's taking note, so many industries outside of sports, but there has been reports about the Zone maybe having issues in terms of surviving this, because the Zone is like a startup in America. Now, outside of America, it's definitely well established. In countries like Japan and Italy, it's almost like the equivalent to ESPN with, millions of subscribers. In America, it's a little different. Have you heard those rumors? Do you think there's anything, any truth to those rumors? And how do you think they'll fare in terms of this whole, slowdown in terms of fights and things like that?
Well, certainly it has to have an impact on their business. Anybody, and not just their business, but it has an impact on ESPN's business. I mean, it's a sports network. There's no sports to televise, and at some point, there, and you have thousands of employees and a lot of airtime to fill up on multiple networks, as well as a website and radio stations that's around the country and that sort of thing. So it's not just at the Zone that's going to feel the impact. The difference, though, is that, as you mentioned, it may be established in other parts of the world where they've done well for themselves. Still, in its infancy in the United States, they've not even been in business for 2 years. A year and a half or so, I guess, when it starts September of 2019, or 2018.
18,
I guess,
yeah.
Fight. So, it hasn't been around that long. And I have to say, to their credit, in the short period of time they have been around, they put on huge fights. They have largely stepped into the void that HBO left behind. That's not to say that the PBC team at Fox and Showtime and ESPN Those two groups have put on a lot of big time good fights. But the biggest names, let's be honest, have been with the zone. I'm talking about Canelo Alvarez. I'm talking about Anthony Joshua. They put on some huge fights, whether it was, bigger names like they just had a Mikey Garcia fight that was, I can't say what it generated subscription-wise. I know I was there. It was a huge crowd, much bigger than I had anticipated down there in Frisco, Texas. But if the zone's live sports offerings are mostly related to boxing, they have some Bellator in the MMA space, and they have obviously some of their studio programming, and they have, I guess, that smattering of soccer leagues and that sort of stuff. But they're basically a boxing streaming service at this point, as they look to try to acquire rights to other leagues and other sports. So this has a dire impact on their business model, because they literally have nothing new to give the subscribers who are paying either the $20 a month or the $100 a year. So I would think that has a huge impact on what they're dealing with. Now, on the flip side of that, they're also not hemorrhaging money right now, because without any sports events to go, they're not paying out a $35 million fee to Canelo for what would have been a fight on May 2nd against Billy Joe Saunders that they didn't know what would draw subscription-wise. So it is a two-edged sword. I mean, they're not blowing their brains out financially at the moment, but they're not probably generating. I think probably what they'll look to do, and again, I don't have this inside knowledge or anything, just my opinion, when this passes or whenever it does or whatever becomes the new normal and sports are able to get back, you hope that they can forego the interim fight between Canelo and Billy Joe Saunders and the Gennady Golovkin fight against Samantha. Have them finally do the third fight with each other and use that fight to sort of relaunch your brand, acquire new subscribers for so many people that want to see that at what would be a very reduced price to get their subscription for the year or even monthly, and do it along those lines. But for right now, they got nothing going on in terms of the live sports, but neither does ESPN, neither does FS1, neither do any of the networks. So it's a problem for everybody in that business. But they, in particular, because they on streaming subscription money for essentially boxing, and there is no boxing right now, and I don't see there being any for a while. So
that's exactly it.
I'll say this also, by the way, and John Skipper that runs the place, who used to run ESPN, and my old boss, thankfully is recovering from his battle through. So I was happy to. I'd heard about that, and I was glad to see that he's doing okay. So, he's a good guy, and I thought he was a great leader at ESPN when he was there. Now with the zone, and glad he's okay.
No, definitely great to hear that he has recovered. He had kept it kind of close to the vest that he had it, and then the article came out. So good to know that he's doing better. That what you were talking about kind of led me into my next question. So, the way it is now in terms of the different networks, we know Showtime has more of the premium cable model similar to HBO. Of course, Fox and ESPN have programming, regular fights, and then pay-per-view fights. And then of course the zone, like we talked about. I personally think when everything gets closer to normal, I think there's going to have to be a change in terms of pay-per-view models, maybe variable pricing, because you can't, let's say even if the biggest matchups happen, it can't just be like 3 pay-per-views a month from different networks and promoters, right? So what's your take? When this stuff gets back to normal, do you think these pricing models and things like that are going to have to change?
I don't know if they have to change, because they're going to have to charge what they have to charge based on what they have to pay out to the fighters and how they think that it will work in terms of making a profit for their event. What I do think has to happen, and pricing aside, that's a discussion that's been going on for a long time, having nothing to do with a global pandemic. I've said to people, like, one day boxing matches on pay-per-view, the big fights were $49.95, maybe they were $54.95, and then all of a sudden they were $80. Like, there was never like a middleman. It never stopped in the middle. It just went from super consistent in that $40 to $50 range to suddenly now $75, $80, and then of course more, because a lot of most people probably order in HD, and they usually tack on really quite understood that. In any event, beyond whatever pricing situation there may be, to me, when the sport kicks back up and there are those pay-per-view level fights, or even just big fights for the networks, whatever network we're speaking about, I think there's going to have to be a period of time where, forget these nonsense tune-up fights. Guys want to be in a fight. You want to make money. You got to fight a real fight, because that's how people are going to come back. No one's coming back to watch, a top name against a much lesser opponent and going to care about it. And there's going to be, once sports starts up again, there's always been heavy competition for sport programming. and the viewers. It's going to be even more so because you're going to have if we're basing this on the fact that maybe things kick back up in the fall, September, October, whatever, you're talking about having a football season, perhaps some semblance of a baseball season, perhaps maybe the end of a basketball or a hockey season. You've already seen, as they've just recently rescheduled things like the Masters tournament and the Kentucky Derby and other major events that take place on the sports calendar. So those things are going to be there, looking for their time with publicity and fan interest. So if you want boxing to be in that level, you're going to have to make some major fights and kick it off in a major way. No more, at least for the time being. I don't want to see, the top A side against, a guy that what's going to happen in the fight. You want to do that, you can do it. Fight on the undercard, you're going to have to take a lot less money, whatever. So I do think that for whatever period of time we go through that's like the wasteland right now where there's nothing, I am hopeful that when things start up, we will see a surge of, pretty significant major fights that will happen right off the bat, whether it's some of the good matches that have been on the calendar that have been postponed, that back rescheduled, or fresh fights that people would like to see.
No, certainly. And I let's definitely hope that happens in terms of the big matchups. You've been really generous with your time, so I'm going to give you a few final questions here in a speed round. Canelo Triple G 3.
I got nothing else to do, my man. I got nothing else going on.
All right, great. So Canelo Triple G 3 would be one of those huge fights, and there have been talks that it would be for September. Who knows exactly when? Let me ask you this: A, do you think that'll happen in 2020? And if it does happen, who do you think this time off is better for? And I'll tell you why I'm asking. So Canelo was going to fight Billy Joe Saunders. That's probably not going to happen. So that means that he doesn't have to go through that opponent before he fights Triple G. Triple G is older. He gets to rest. That's probably a good thing, except that he's getting older as the months go by, right? And that's not good. So do you think the fight will happen, and who's benefiting from the break in between?
I kind of suspect that if there are fights back, any kind of normal semblance of a schedule before the end of this year, that probably would be the next fight, because for a whole variety of reasons. One, Billy Joe Saunders, having nothing to do with coronavirus, is facing a suspension by the British board for his stupid videos that were put on social media in the last week. So people don't know about that. They can just hit a quick Google and find out pretty quickly.
Yep.
So that may be Saunders' problem. But I think that, as I mentioned, because there's going to be an appetite for a big fight right off the bat, that would be the way to do it. So if there's big fights before the end of this year, that may be the one that happens, or perhaps it's at the early part of next year. But I kind of suspect that when the next time we see them in the ring, probably will be against each other. As far as the time off goes, you made good points about that. I don't think it has super benefits for either guy, because you want to have guys stay at least somewhat active. Golovkin's a little bit older. Maybe the time off is not a bad thing for him. But by the same token, there's the rust factor. He did come off a very, very, very difficult fight in his most recent matchup against Derevyanchenko. So maybe he could have used a little bit more time. Canelo, I think the quicker the fights are, the better for him, because I still think he's in his prime and still adding to his arsenal. And the more often he fights in shorter periods of time between those fights, the sharper he gets. So I guess if I had a pick, I'd say the time off is probably better for Golovkin, but I can find reasons to think that it might be the other way around.
And a similar question for another fight is Fury Wilder 3. And I'll tell you my thoughts, and I'd love to hear yours. So the time off, I think, will definitely benefit Wilder, because he gets an opportunity to reevaluate things. He just lost for the first time in his career. He started boxing at 18. Now he's 34 years old, never tasted defeat. So it's the first time to kind of look back and say, this worked, this didn't, make some changes. And for Fury, on the flip side, we know mental health has played an issue, and mental health can creep up when inactivity is around. Now, we've seen him on social media. It looks like he's keeping busy, which is great, because that's what we all want to see. We want to see him healthy and keeping busy. But it's interesting, because if it was an immediate rematch in July or whatever it was, June or July, it would have been different. Now it's going to be later in the year. They're saying October. Do you think that fight will happen, and who's benefiting again from this time off?
I mean, I do suspect that will happen, whether it's in October, like you said, they were originally going to do the fight July 18th, I believe, was the date that was on hold for that fight. Clearly, that's not happening. They've already said that the new date was supposed to be, again, it was never set in stone. Bob Arum and the Wilder camps have both told me they were looking at early October. Given what's happening with the boxing schedule and the other fights that are going to be going on, I'm not sure if even if fights come back at that point that we're going to be ready for a big pay-per-view fight when there's going to be so much other activity at that time. You know, it wouldn't shock me if that went maybe even into early part of next year. I do think, though, that will be their next fight unless, you know, suddenly Deontay Wilder has a change of heart because he's the one that exercised his contractual right to a rematch. So I do think that fight will still be the next fight. You know, Fury, I've seen those videos also, does seem to be keeping himself together, you know, I saw him doing some funny workouts where he was basically, you know, using his wife as a, you know, lifting weights. One of the things Fury has said to myself and other reporters, you know, when he's discussed his mental health is that training helps keep him in the right frame of mind. Exactly. But it doesn't have to necessarily be training for a fight. It's just a matter of going to the gym and going through the workouts that he does, whether he's actually getting ready for a fight or not. He wanted to maintain that regularity. So I'm glad to see that he's okay. As far as the time off, I totally agree with you. The time off is probably much better for Wilder to assess what happened, to come up with what, you know, they can determine will be a better game plan. You know, but I looked at it like this. When Deontay Wilder fought Tyson Fury the first time, Fury tried to box him and you know, and move and use his jab and that sort of thing. And, you know, Fury couldn't win. Got a draw, even though a lot of people thought he won, but he didn't get the W. So but Wilder didn't win either. So he was not successful against a Fury that boxed against him. And in the rematch, Tyson Fury completely style and fought him, you know, straight up, went right to him, brawled, and just tried to slug away. And Wilder couldn't win with him fighting that style either. So the question that Wilder and his people, you know, with this extra time off can use to their benefit when they analyze those videos and think about how they want to approach things is, well, which way are we going to fight the guy? This failed both ways. I mean, those are basically the two ways you fight. You either box or you be more straightforward. But the time off probably should help him both mentally and physically. You know, Fury, you know, looks so sharp. I'm sure he doesn't want this time off because to get him back in the ring, get Wilder back in the ring so much, you know, such a short turnaround from the second fight to the third fight, I think would have been a very good thing for Tyson. The longer it waits, probably the better it is for Wilder.
Right, exactly. As long as Fury has access to a gym or some kind of training or running outside and is staying away from drinking and drugs, we hope that he'll be okay. So last question in terms of these hypothetical matchups, the welterweight division. I mean, we know that Spence was supposed to fight Garcia in the beginning of the year. Of course, the car crash. Then there's Manny Pacquiao in the mix. And you've kind of heard all of those names. You've heard, I talked to Spence's trainer, even after the accident, they said they still want Pacquiao or Garcia. Keith Thurman wants a rematch with Pacquiao. So in terms of those matchups, I mean, which one do you think will come together for the fall in the welterweight division?
In a perfect world, it would be Spence versus Crawford. But, you know, even if we can think that may happen sooner than later, and if there's room for any kind of glimmer of hope, it's that when PBC and Top Rank teamed up to do the fight between Wilder and Fury on pay-per-view, if you ask people from both sides, it went very seamlessly. They worked together very well, and there was no real animosity or any real issues, completely the opposite of the way it was when they also worked together doing a fight between Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather. You know, the people that, you know, that was an HBO Showtime endeavor. The Wilder and Fury rematch, that was an ESPN Fox endeavor. The people from Fox and ESPN got along very well. The promoter side of things, everybody worked together well. The PR staffs worked together very well. And I can just tell you from my experience of covering both events, they were the complete opposite. Covering Wilder and Fury, too, was an absolute pleasure. Covering Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather from a coverage perspective and from dealing with, you know, not the matchup, because everybody was excited about it, even if the fight didn't live up to the hype. But covering that fight week and everything leading up to it was the worst experience of my professional career. And if you asked plenty of other journalists that covered that event also, they would probably tell you the same thing. But because they worked together very well on the fight between Wilder and Fury, you know, I'm hopeful that they can translate that to the possibility of doing a fight between Spence and Crawford. But I don't necessarily think that happens next. I think what we're probably looking at, and again, it's going to depend on what kind of site fee is available. The Pacquiao people will tell you that there's been a lot of conversation about Manny doing a fight in Saudi Arabia, in a place, Jeddah, where they held the World Boxing Super Series final in the super middleweight division. Callum Smith defeated George Groves in the final to win one of the world titles. So that's a possibility of Pacquiao fighting there. And it seems that the likely opponent for that fight would be Mikey Garcia, who, you know, lost to Errol Spence at welterweight, but in his next fight, which was just a month or so ago in Frisco, Texas, looked pretty good. Exciting fight against Jesse Vargas, won that fight. And said that he wanted to fight Pacquiao. Pacquiao has said no problem. His team has said no problem with a Mikey Garcia fight. Pacquiao, of course, would be the favorite, but probably a decent fight. Probably, I think, maybe more competitive than we would have saw between Mikey and Errol Spence. So I think Pacquiao probably looks towards that fight. And maybe with Spence, when he comes back, it still remains to be seen. Is he going to take a smaller fight because to see how he is after the car crash, or is he going to step in against a real top opponent? Now, he said when he did his interview on one of the Fox broadcasts at the end that he didn't want to tune up. So I sort of thought that maybe that would mean when he comes back, they would just try to put back together the fight between Errol and Danny Garcia, which is still an attractive, appealing matchup. That's still two top guys. And he had the fight against Red Catch in January, got that win. So I guess I could see a situation where we saw a Spence against a Danny Garcia, a Pacquiao against a Mikey Garcia, and then let the other guys at the top of that weight division sort themselves out. There's been talk about Crawford when he comes back, possibly fighting a Kell Brook, maybe even going to England to do so, which he seems to have no problem doing. He did it when he won his world title in the lightweight division. He fought overseas in the UK. Those are some of the fights that you hear about. But the good thing about that weight class is there's so many good names that you can mix and match a lot of those guys. Even if some of them might be rematches, there's still plenty of good fights to make.
It's funny hearing you talk about all these names. It makes me itch so badly just to see any kind of boxing. I'm sure you're in the same boat. Would you watch Guillermo Rigondeaux hitting a heavy bag right now?
Let's not get that carried away. No, I'm only kidding. Yeah, I mean, I've been itching for it, like you said. The last fight I covered was March 7th in New York between at the Barclays Center between Adam Konacki and the upset loss to Robert Helenius. And I was supposed to go back to New York. I was supposed to come home that Sunday and return to New York City on Thursday to cover the top-ranked fight that was on that Saturday at the Madison Square Garden Theater between Shakur Stevenson and Miguel Mariaga. It would have been Shakur Stevenson's first weight title defense. And obviously that was the first card that ended up getting canceled because of this outbreak. And then canceled that show as well as the Michael Conlon card they were doing on Tuesday. And then it was just dominoes from there. Pretty much everything was being canceled and postponed, not just in boxing, but throughout the entire sports world. But yeah, I mean, I've been filling the void in that sense. I've watched a lot of YouTube fights, videos of old fights on YouTube, or my own personal DVD collection that is massive, and even video collection of VHS. So I've delved into that a little bit. That's the one good thing that I've heard from a lot of fans on social media, can you give me some ideas of what to watch? So I've thrown out some, lists and some other great fights from the past that maybe not everybody has seen, some that are very famous, some that are maybe a little bit more obscure, but still worth watching. Showtime did a thing a week or so ago where they replayed in the same prime time slot where they would have put a live fight on, where they replayed the first three fights between Rafael Marquez and Israel Vasquez. We sort of disavowed the fourth fight. So they put those on back to back to back. I just saw an announcement from Showtime today that they're going to replay some other great fights that they've had from the past. They're going to replay to me, the all-time greatest fight ever, certainly the best one I ever covered, the 2005 first fight between Diego Chico Corrales and Jose Luis Castillo for the lightweight title. The unification fight, which is an epic fight, they're going to replay. I forget if it was the first one or the second one, but they'll replay one of the two tremendous fights between Johnny Tapia and Paulie Ayala. And there was two or three fights that they were going to show past fight of the I think it was John Molina against Lucas Matisse, which was a past Boxing Writers Association of America Fight of the Year. So Steve Espinoza at Showtime, they understand that there's a lot of fans that are anxious to see some good fights, so they're delving into their library and putting that stuff on. Obviously, if you subscribe to DAZN, their library is there for people to watch what they've had. ESPN Plus has plenty of boxing in their archive of some of their previous fights that can. If you're bummed out about not having live fights, I totally get it, and I'm with you. But it's also a good time, if you're a new fan, to go study some of the past history. If you've been a big fan and you haven't really gone back to some of the great fights of the past, spend a little bit of time looking at some of those fights and lose yourself in that for an hour or two. Go down that rabbit hole on YouTube and you'll find all kinds of great material. The day that we're recording this happens to be the 33rd anniversary of the fight between Sugar Ray Leonard and Marvin Hagler for the middleweight title. I spent some time watching that fight earlier today. One of the all-time, biggest fights in the history of the sport, controversy, and a tremendous fight. So there's still that's one thing that sets boxing apart, Curran, that I think compared to a lot of other sports. Most people don't really want to go back and watch maybe a baseball game from 10 years ago, or even a basketball game, maybe certain games here and there. There's way more interest, at least from what I can tell, in going back and reliving old fights than other sporting events, it seems to me, compared to watching an old soccer match or a tennis match or something like that. But boxing fans love to watch old fights. And there's no new fights, so take some of your time and go watch some of those old fights. Anybody with a computer can find untold amounts of great fights from the past.
No, 100%. I mean, right now is the time to do that. For me, I've been saying the fight that I want to watch on repeat is Klitschko Joshua. Such a great fight. The fights you mentioned were great. Gotti Ward, of course, Hagler Hearns. I mean, it goes on and on. There's so many. Last question for you, and don't ban me for this. Have you gone back and watched any Freza Kendo fights at all?
I have not. I can assure you. The one thing I might watch would be when he got knocked out by John Ruiz. No, just kidding.
There you go.
But there are, at this point, it might get to a point where you might have to watch one of those old fights because there's nothing else going on in the boxing world. And as I said earlier, the unfortunate part is the fans are not getting new fights, but the fighters are suffering because they don't have any action, no activity, so they're not getting paid. I saw some comments from a couple of fighters on Twitter about how, I think joking, perhaps half serious, this is over. How much are you going to weigh? There's going to be a lot of guys that are going to have to lose a lot of weight to make their weight for fights, when this is over with. So the fighters are in a difficult spot. Unless you're at the very elite level where you've made, huge amounts of money, like a Joshua, a Canelo, guys that are making 7 figures, which is a tiny fraction of the overall number of professional boxers. Most boxers, they can go a little ways or they fight, but with no income and no foreseeable income in boxing, it's very difficult. And by the way, the same goes for their trainers. Same goes for the folks that own the gyms. Same goes for the promoters. No matter how much money Top Rank has made, when there's nothing coming in, they still have employees. They still have a building. They still have property. They still have a staff. There's no money there. And then you have some of the smaller promoters that haven't had shows in a while that don't even have the luxury of the network contracts. At least if you're a Top Rank or your PBC or your Golden Boy or your Matchroom, when this does start up again, they know that they have money coming from their broadcast partners. But if you're some of those smaller promoters who count on live gates from some of your shows, a Lou DiBella, a Joe DeGuardia, a Thompson Boxing, those types of promoters, you don't even have those anymore. So, you can go for a little while, but at some point, you have to put a fight on. So this is not just going to impact the fans not getting to see fights. To me, that's frankly the least of it. It's all the people that make their living in boxing when fights happen. That tragedy of this, besides the obvious, the people that are getting sick and dying.
No, that's exactly it. If you ever look up a fight on BoxRec, if you go to that date, you can see all the other fights around the world, and there's so many fighters, so many people training, things like that, and they're all obviously having financial issues during this time. So let's hope that everything can get back to normal sooner than later. Dan Rafael, I want to thank you so much for the time, for breaking it down, for giving us something to look forward to. Hopefully after this is all over, we can have a mythical boxing barbecue chat or something like that when then everything gets back to normal.
Curran, thanks a lot, my man.